Here we're going to continue off of last week's episode where I showed you how to add authorization from scratch. We're working on this forum application where users can perform different actions depending on whether they are logged in or marked as an admin. So if I am not an admin as this user, then I am not able to destroy a topic, for example. This is accomplished through this allow method on the permission class, which we set up previously, and the controller and view layer will delegate to this method, so all authorization logic is contained within this one place. This also allows us to test this behavior easily, so we can test all the branching possibilities at a low level, so they don't have to be all tested at a high request spec level. The first thing I want to do here is refactor this permission class so that we can have a type of DSL or domain-specific language to define the permissions, so we don't have to use this return true statement and just scatter throughout this allow method. So here's how I want this to work. Instead of inheriting from a struct for this permission class, I'm just going to define an initialize method, which will take a user model that we're passing in through the controller. And then I want an allow method where we have the controller name, such as users, and the actions name, such as new and create, passed in here through symbols. And then I can just define this depending on the current user's permissions. There we go. So this should do something similar to what I have below here. It's just a little cleaner, and it allows us the flexibility of using symbols or strings. Also, I want to point out that in this case, I want to call an allow all method to give an admin user access to everything. Now, I still need to define these two methods and also change the behavior of this allow query method. So I'll start off by defining the allow all method, and this will just set an instance variable so that I can actually just check that at a later point. Now the allow method is a little trickier. This could take one or multiple controller names and action names, and so we need to somehow get around that. And a quick way to do that is just to wrap this in a call to array like this. So that way, if it's a single item or single symbol here, then it's just going to wrap it in an array. Otherwise, it will just return the current array. So we can just loop through each of these, and I want to do the same thing for the actions and loop through each of those within the controllers. And then we have to store this information in an instance variable so we can check it later. And I'm actually going to make this a hash. Let's just call it allowed actions. And this is actually going to be an array as the hash key here. That's just sort of a quick way to do a lookup of multiple items like our controller and action name. And I'll just set the value to true. Now there are a couple of more things I need to do to get this working, and that is I need to standardize on either using a symbol or a string in the key here just to make it easy to look it up. And I'm going to use a string because using a symbol and converting it to a symbol, it can introduce memory leaks if the content is dynamic and not consistent. So just to reduce that possibility, I am standardizing it there. And also for the allowed actions, I need to default that to an empty hash. Now the last step is to implement this allow query method, where we can just check if the allow all is set or allowed actions includes the controller converted to a string and the action name converted to a string. Now you might want to also check to make sure that these instance variables are defined before continuing to reduce the chance of warnings, but that's a little bit of an edge case I won't be addressing here. So with that refactoring, all of our tests are still passing. But now we have the flexibility of using symbols if we want. And there we go. I think this looks nicer, but it's a personal preference. By the way, I do want to point out that this permission class is now more complex than it was before. And it's up to you on each situation if you think that this extra complexity is worth it in the long run for the nicer permissions. If you have a lot of permissions here, then probably a nicer interface is worth it. Also, you may not even want to go in this direction if you want to move the permission definitions elsewhere, such as the database. In that case, that allow method could just check the database each time to see if the given user has permissions to perform that action. Whatever the case, having this permission class be a central hub to the authorization allows us to easily change how this all works without affecting the rest of the application. All right, now let's move on to adding some features to our authorization. Currently, users are able to edit any topic record, but I only really want them to edit topics that they create. So how do we add that restriction here? Currently, we aren't passing in enough information to perform this authorization check. We just pass in the action name. Instead, we also need to pass in the resource record so that we can perform authorization on various attributes of that. I'm thinking the resource could just be passed in as an optional third argument here. So let's test drive this behavior. First of all, I'm going to move this user record out into a let call so we can access it directly. And that way, I can also build a topic around it. So actually, let's call this user topic. So that's going to be the topic that has a user assigned to it like this. And also, let's make another topic that does not have the user assigned to it. So that way we can reference whichever topic we want to test on. Oh, and since I might do a check on the user ID, I'm going to create that user record here. And then let's pass that in as a third argument. Let's say that it should not allow access if we don't pass anything. But if we do pass let's say other topic in, then we shouldn't allow access here either. But if we pass in the user topic, then we do want to allow access to that. So I'll say should allow access in that case. And of course our specs fail since we aren't expecting a third argument passed into that method. Well, it's easy enough to allow this method to accept a third resource argument that's optional, but then how do we perform an authorization check on its attributes? Well, what I want to do is have this allow method accept a block that we can pass that instance object into it and then perform the check in here. But I only want it to be performed on the edit and update methods, so I'm just going to clean this up a little bit so that it's only checked on those edit and update actions, and then we can check if the topic user ID equals the current user's ID. Okay, so now I just have to fill in these missing pieces between the definition and the check. So I'm going to pass this block in through this allow method, and we need to keep track of it, so I'm going to set it as a value in this hash, or if no block is present, it's just going to be true. So this means this might return either a block or true. So this I will set into a local variable here and perform a check on this. And we want to see that it's allowed and that either allowed equals true, or that we have a resource and that the allowed block calling it, passing in the resource returns either true or false. So it'll trigger this block here. Well, now we're back to passing specs again. It worked. So this means when I perform the allow check in the view, I can pass in the topic instance so that it will check based on those attributes as well here. Let's try this out, reloading this page, and the edit link disappears on all these topics because they weren't created by this current user. But if I do create a topic, and then I am able to edit that because I'm the author. Actually, let's try it. Clicking on edit, and I get not authorized because the controller isn't passing in the resource into the check. Before I fix this, I'm first going to duplicate this bug with a high-level request spec. I'm going to paste it in for the sake of time. I'm just logging in as a user who's not an admin, creating a topic that the user owns, and trying to edit that topic, and I should not have the content unauthorized when I try to do so. And this fails just like it did in the browser. To make this work, we'll need to pass in the current resource into this allow method that we check in the application controller before filter we set up in the last episode. But this can be a little bit tricky and there are a variety of ways to do so. I'm just going to make a method called current resource on this application controller, and I'll just have it return nil here, but I can override it in the subclass. So I'll do that at the bottom of my topics controller here. I'll just paste in the method definition overriding the current resource method and finding the topic which matches the ID if it exists. And so you might want to go a step further and use this method every time you're fetching the topic in the other actions so that there's no duplication here, and it's also a little more performance. And our tests are green again. Yay! So if I did that right, it should also work in the browser. And it does. So with that working, let's tackle another problem with authorization, and that is restricting access to specific attributes. So if in my edit form here, let's say I don't want to allow members to be able to mark a topic as sticky, but admins should be able to. I'm going to start in the form view for this because I know I want this sticky field to be hidden if the user doesn't have permission, and starting here will allow me to define the interface on how I want it to behave. So let's have a helper method called allow param, and then we can pass in the model name, in this case topic, and the attribute name such as sticky. And we can do that for each field that we want to perform an authorization check on, so we can do it for the topic name as well. Now I need to define that helper method, and I'm going to have it delegate to the current permission object just like I did with this allow method in the application controller. So I'll just copy and paste this here and call this allow param. And you might want to rename the normal allow method to allow action just so there's no confusion. I won't do that here, but it might not be a bad idea. Now I just need to implement that behavior in the permission class, which I'm going to test drive in this permission spec. So when I'm a member, I want it to, the permission should allow the parameter for topic name, but it should not allow the sticky parameter. And also, as an admin, it should allow anything. So I'm going to add this allow param anything here. Oh, and I do need to implement this allow param matcher. So to get this to work, I'll just copy and paste this allow matcher because it works very similar. Just allow param. We'll delegate to the allow param query method. And that fails because our permission class does not respond to allow param. So going into that permission class, I want the defining of this permission to work similar to the allow action method, but let's call this allow param, and so let's give access to the topic name. And this way this user won't be able to edit the sticky attribute. So this means we'll need to define this allow param method and the query version of this method on this class. And I'm going to paste in those method definitions because just to save us some time. So the allow param method accepts either an array or a single element of resources or attributes, and this is just going to store them up in a hash with array value for each of the attributes. So it'll say like allowed params topic and then an array of attributes that are allowed. And that way the query parameter can check on it. So if they're not all allowed already, then it's going to see if that resource exists in the allowed parameters and then just see if it's included that specific attribute. And look at that, we're back to passing. And when I reload this edit topic form, the sticky parameter disappears here so we can only edit the name. However, this is only one side of the puzzle. If we submit this and actually provide a sticky parameter directly, then it's going to accept it and actually update the topic. So we need to restrict this. So this is a common mass assignment problem. To illustrate this problem, I'm going to paste in a request spec. So this makes sure that I cannot create a sticky topic as a member. Now I normally use Capybara in request specs, but here I'm using the Rails integration test directly so that I can post requests instead of going through the web interface, because security issues like this usually shouldn't have a web interface for their vulnerability, so this way I can post them directly. So first I create a user, and that's not an admin, and log him in, and then I try creating a topic that is both has a name and a sticky parameter, and I make sure that the topic has a name but not marked as sticky. Now when I run this, it fails because I am currently able to mark a topic as sticky. It's not restricting that parameter for normal members. Now you may have noticed that I'm using strong parameters in this application like I showed in episode 371. This is because it's a lot more flexible with permissions, and also it's going to be default in Rails 4. So I have this topic params method in the topics controller, which basically permits the parameters name and sticky on the topic params. So I want to make this more dynamic, so I only permit the parameters that are marked as accessible in the permission class. So what I would ideally like is that this controller doesn't have to worry about this at all, and I can just access the topic parameters like I could before, and everything will happen automatically for me in a before filter. So let's do that in this application controller. We have this authorize before filter already set up. So I'm going to adjust this a little bit. If the person is authorized, then I want to permit certain parameters. So I'm going to call current permission and then permit params, and I'll end it with a bang because I am going to adjust the parameters hash directly. Next, I'll go into the permission class and implement that permit params method. I'm going to paste it down here at the bottom. So the way this works is it accepts a params hash from the controller, and first we'll check if we allow all, and then if so, we're going to just call permit with a bang on the params hash, and that's a method that strong parameters provides to allow everything. Otherwise, we're going to loop through all of the allowed parameters that we defined above and basically call a permit on each of those allowed resources and passing in the given attributes which we have defined as allowed. And when we check out our tests, well, they're almost all passing except for this one failure, which is raising this forbidden attributes exception when we try to update a topic as an admin. So for some reason, the admin isn't able to update the topic's attributes. As it turns out, this permit with a bang call we're doing when we're an admin doesn't work recursively, so if there are nested hashes in here, it's not going to permit those. However, this issue is fixed in the Git repository, so hopefully there will be a new gem release soon. In the meantime, I'm going to change our gem file so that it references the Git repository for strong parameters instead of the gem release, so that way we'll get that fix. Now after running the bundle command, we're back in the green. Alright, now our authorization system is feature complete. As a member, we can only edit topics that we own, and then we can't even mark them as sticky here. However, if we are an admin user, then we can mark them as sticky. But if we're signed out, then we can't really do anything. So all of this is fully locked down in a pretty global way. Now let me give you a few tips about testing with permissions. When I'm doing request specs, I like to try to keep permission logic out of this so that I avoid all the branching possibilities. And it's very tempting to just always sign in as an admin when testing at this high level so I don't have to worry about permissions. However, I don't recommend doing that because instead I recommend signing in as whatever the lowest role possible to successfully execute the test. In this case, to list out the topics, I'm just a guest user. So this way I don't run into the case where I accidentally forget to grant permission to a guest or member user to perform a specific action, which is pretty easy to do if you're always signed in as an admin. You publish your application and then realize the actual member can't access that page. Also, I do have a few specs that are specifically about testing authorization, but I pretty much keep these to a minimum and use this more to test drive the functionality rather than test all the branching paths. I try to keep authorization logic very global throughout the entire application with very few if statements in the controller level, so these are all pretty much covering all cases at the controller level with just a few specs. Next, I want to point out something in the permission spec. I'm following the practice here where there's one assertion per spec with a lot of it blocks. However, this can make your tests slow because if there's any setup code, such as there's quite a bit of setup code here, a lot of this is going to be run for every it call. So you might want to consider collapsing this into one spec for if you're doing a lot of this because it can really slow down your tests. So here's what that might look like. There we go, we have one block, and I usually like to break up each block based off of the resource, so it kind of groups it all together. Now, if there does happen to be a failure, our spec will show you the exact line that failed, so it is easy to find it even if you have a lot of assertions in one spec. Now, this has been a pretty long couple of episodes since I've walked you through all the details, but let me review the end result of what it takes to add authorization from scratch. Starting in this application controller, we have this authorize before filter, and then we do a couple method delegations, and then we have these three methods defined, including the authorize one, which is run before each of the requests. And then in the topics controller, we implemented this current resource method, which is something you'll want to add for each of the RESTful style controllers. And then finally, we have that permission class, which does contain quite a bit of code, but is all nicely isolated here. And really the only part you have to manage and be concerned with is this right here, where you change the permission definitions depending on your application. In the end, I think this is a really great setup, but some applications have complex permissions where this class can get a little out of hand. In that case, you might want to split it up where you have each class representing a user role, something like this. Okay, so off camera, I split up that permission class into 4 other permission classes, and they're all namespaced within this permissions module. So this has a method called permissions for user, which is designed to be called from the controller, just passing in the current user. This will return the permission instance depending on the user's role. This way, that permission definition logic can all be nested within the given role permission. So if we have our guest permission, you can see it's a lot simpler here. Same with our member permission, focusing only on what that type of a user has access to. And all of the complex logic is hidden within this base permission class, which is something you probably won't need to visit or change to regularly, so that way you can focus entirely on how you want the permission defined. By the way, splitting up the classes like this based on the role can easily be done with can as well if you want to use that gem instead of doing it from scratch. Well, that's all I have for this episode on creating authorization from scratch. I hope you found it useful.